The crack era wasn't just a drug epidemic, it was a war zone hidden in plain sight. The full story of the crack era, a story of survival in Black America, takes you deep into one of the most devastating chapters in American history. From the late 70s through the 90s, crack cocaine tore through Black communities like wildfire, leaving trauma, broken families, and mass incarceration in its wake. But this isn't just a story of destruction. It's one of survival, of resilience, of people who lived through it, fought back, and still carry the scars. This film uncovers the complex web of politics, poverty, systemic racism, and government negligence that allowed this crisis to explode. From the street corners to Capitol Hill, you'll hear from survivors, former dealers, families, and historians who lived it and studied it. How did a cheap, smokable drug bring entire neighborhoods to their knees? Who profited and who paid the price? This is more than a history lesson. It's a reminder of what happens when a nation turns its back on its own people. Don't just watch, listen, because the full story of the crack era has never been told like this before. Before crack, there was a storm brewing, not in a single neighborhood, but across an entire nation. In the early 1980s, America was in a tense, transformative moment. The country had just come out of the turbulent 70s, Vietnam, Watergate, the oil crisis, and entered a new era of conservative politics under President Ronald Reagan. While the suburbs saw economic optimism, the inner cities, especially predominantly Black neighborhoods, were decaying under the weight of unemployment, underfunded schools, and rising crime. Entire communities were being left behind by a government shifting priorities from people to profits. In these communities, industry had vanished. Factories closed. Jobs disappeared. Families once anchored by stable blue-collar work found themselves in a deepening crisis. It wasn't just economics, it was social erosion. Public housing crumbled, resources evaporated, and hope felt like a luxury few could afford. In this vacuum, an underground economy began to take root, and the conditions were ripe for something devastating to erupt. Mainstream America barely noticed. Television showed suburban dreams and stock market highs, but skipped over boarded-up buildings and crumbling tenements. The growing desperation was out of sight, and so it stayed out of mind, until the explosion came. What no one knew yet was that a drug was on the way, one so addictive, so cheap, and so destructive that it would rewrite the DNA of entire neighborhoods. Its name was crack. To understand how it spread so fast, we have to understand the emotional terrain of the people it affected. These weren't people waiting to become addicts. They were parents, teenagers, veterans, workers, all facing economic extinction. And when survival becomes your full-time job, you reach for what's within reach. Crack promised escape, a high that cost less than a meal. It seemed like relief at first. And so the stage was set, a nation divided, a media distracted, and a powder about to ignite. The crack era didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was born in the pressure cooker of systemic neglect, racial inequality, and political silence. What came next would not only devastate lives, but expose just how deeply America's cracks ran beneath the surface. Cocaine was already a booming drug among the wealthy elite in the late 70s and early 80s. It was expensive, glamorized, and seen as a high-class substance. But then came a game changer: crack. By converting powdered cocaine into small, smokable rocks, dealers created a product that was far cheaper, more potent, and infinitely more addictive. Suddenly, a $100 high was accessible for $5. And with that transformation, a new economy was born, fast, ruthless, and lethal. The process was simple, and the profit margins were massive. With minimal investment, street dealers could cook crack in kitchens, and turn a few grams of cocaine into a booming side hustle. It was capitalism at its rawest. No regulations, no taxes, just quick money and quicker destruction. For some, it seemed like an opportunity, a way out of poverty. For others, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would swallow families whole. Distribution networks spread rapidly through urban centers, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami, moving faster than law enforcement could track. Word of mouth fueled demand. And because crack's high was short but intense, users returned over and over, chasing that first euphoric rush. In just a few months, entire blocks transformed into open-air drug markets. The economy of the streets had shifted, and it was deadly. But crack didn't just take hold because it was cheap. It took hold because it filled a void. In communities stripped of opportunity, dignity, and resources, crack offered what the system didn't: escape, income, and control, however fleeting. The tragedy was that the cost was invisible at first. But soon, that cost would become brutally clear in addiction, in violence, and in an explosion of broken lives. This was no accident. The ingredients for this crisis weren't just economic, they were political. The Reagan administration had slashed social programs while ramping up military and police budgets. In the absence of investment, crack flourished. And while media focused on the chaos it caused, few asked how it got there or why it was allowed to stay. By the mid-1980s, the crack epidemic wasn't just a crisis, it was a war zone, and black communities were the battleground. Entire neighborhoods were caught in a cycle of fear, addiction, and violence. It wasn't just the drug, it was the ecosystem it spawned. Turf wars over territory exploded. Young boys, barely teenagers, were pulled into street-level dealing. Guns flooded the streets. Overnight, blocks that once echoed with the sounds of kids playing turned into corners where silence meant survival. Families were shredded from the inside. Mothers disappeared into addiction. Fathers vanished into prisons. Children, often left to raise themselves or their siblings, learned to normalize trauma. The crack era created a generation raised on resilience, but also steeped in grief. It wasn't rare to attend more funerals than birthdays. The emotional toll was immeasurable. Whole communities living in survival mode. What made it worse was the silence from outside. Government aid didn't come, not the kind that would matter. There were no job programs, no housing reform, no mental health support. Instead, there was judgment. Crack was painted in the media not just as a drug, but as a cultural failure. The narrative blamed the users, not the system. It dehumanized the addicted and vilified the communities they came from. In schools, discipline replaced counseling. In hospitals, care was replaced with criminal suspicion. Police presence skyrocketed, but protection didn't follow. Raids, stop and frisks, helicopters overhead. This was daily life. The line between protection and occupation was erased, and the children growing up in this storm internalized a brutal lesson. Society saw them not as kids in danger, but as threats to be neutralized. Yet even in the darkest corners, there was light. Grandmothers became guardians, churches doubled as food banks and safe spaces. Community leaders emerged, organizing, resisting, surviving. The spirit of resistance didn't die. It went underground, working behind the scenes to hold on to whatever humanity crack hadn't stolen. Because even when the system gave up on them, these communities never gave up on themselves. As crack spread, the U.S. government didn't respond with empathy or resources. It responded with force. The so-called war on drugs, declared by Reagan and amplified by politicians on both sides of the aisle, became a war on Black America. Police funding ballooned. SWAT raids became routine. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws exploded, and with them, the prison population. Crack wasn't just a health issue. It was turned into a criminal epidemic. The sentencing disparity was glaring. Possessing 5 grams of crack earned the same sentence as 500 grams of powdered cocaine, the drug of the wealthy. This 100-to-1 ratio wasn't just unfair, it was strategic. Because crack was prevalent in black neighborhoods and powdered cocaine in white ones, the law effectively turned poverty into a prison sentence. Suddenly, non-violent users were facing decades behind bars, ripped away from their families for what would have been a rehab stint elsewhere. This crackdown didn't solve the problem. It deepened it. With fathers, mothers, and young men being locked away en masse, entire communities were destabilized. Prisons became a business, and black bodies became their currency. The ripple effect was massive. Economic instability, broken homes, a generation growing up without parental guidance, and all of it cloaked in the language of law and order. Politicians earned votes on tough-on-crime rhetoric. News media stoked fear with images of super predators and drug-infested ghettos, but rarely did they show the full picture: the mother begging for treatment instead of jail, the teenager selling crack because his school had no textbooks. The war on drugs wasn't a war on addiction, it was a war on the poor, on the black, on the already abandoned. And behind the statistics were real people, not numbers, lives, stories, dreams interrupted, children waiting for visits behind glass, entire family trees reshaped by a prison industrial complex that didn't ask why, only how long. It wasn't just punishment, it was policy designed to control, to disappear, to erase, and it worked for a while. But even in cages, resistance grew. Books passed between bunk beds, legal challenges filed from payphones, hope clung to by those who refused to let their stories end in numbers. Amid the devastation, there were those who stood tall. The crack era wasn't just a story of collapse, it was a story of survival. In kitchens and living rooms across Black America, resilience was cooking alongside trauma. Mothers became counselors, kids became caretakers. Neighbors formed unspoken alliances to protect each other, because when the system fails, people create systems of their own. There were women who opened their doors to feed children who weren't their own. Men who patrolled corners, not to sell but to keep peace. Teachers who dipped into their own paychecks to buy supplies for students whose parents were gone. Churches became sanctuaries, barber shops became therapy rooms. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't always enough, but it was real. And in many places, it was all there was. Underground networks of support grew. Former addicts turned counselors. Community members trained each other in basic health care. Activists taught tenants how to fight evictions. This wasn't just resistance, it was architecture. Black resilience built informal institutions where formal ones had collapsed. These unsung heroes didn't make headlines, but they saved lives every single day. And there were stories, not the ones news cameras chased, but quieter ones. The teenager who got out and brought 3 of his friends with him. The grandmother raising 5 grandchildren on her own. The block captain who risked her life to mediate gang disputes. These were people who didn't just survive the crack era, they beat it back inch by inch. There was power in that survival. It spoke not just to the strength of individuals, but to the culture of community that Black America has always relied on. In the absence of justice, they made their own. In the absence of peace, they found purpose. Survival wasn't passive, it was an act of rebellion, a refusal to surrender identity, dignity, and humanity. So while the crack era is remembered for what it destroyed, it should also be remembered for what it revealed. That even in the harshest environments, people will build, protect, and heal, not because they're unbreakable, but because they believe that the future deserves to be fought for. While crack tore through communities, it also shaped the culture, especially through music, film, and media. Hip-hop, still young in the 80s, became the loudest voice in the room, telling stories no one else wanted to hear. Rappers became griots, narrating the pain, chaos, and complexity of life in crack-era America. Albums like Public Enemy's It Takes a Nation of Millions or NWA's Straight Outta Compton weren't just records, they were urgent dispatches from the front lines. But with that voice came controversy. Politicians labeled rap dangerous. Media blamed it for glorifying violence, ignoring that it was often the only outlet for truth. Where mainstream news failed to show the real toll of the crack era, music filled the void. It told the stories of broken homes, police brutality, and the feeling of being forgotten. And it reached ears far beyond the neighborhoods it described. Film and TV weren't far behind. From New Jack City to The Wire, stories of crack's impact became entertainment, sometimes honest, sometimes exploitative. While some depictions brought depth and humanity, others reduced communities to caricatures. Audiences got the action, the guns, the trauma, but rarely the context, rarely the history, rarely the systemic roots that made the crack era possible. Mainstream media coverage was even worse. Headlines screamed about crack babies and super predators fueling panic and policy. Rarely did they show the mothers crying in courtrooms or the teachers watching classrooms empty out. The language of the era, sensational, dehumanizing, racist, helped justify the harshest laws. And decades later, we still live with the damage that language caused. Yet in all this, there was also reclamation. Artists, writers, poets, and filmmakers began retelling these stories with nuance. Not as tabloid tragedy, but as human history. They highlighted not just the fall, but the fight, the resilience, the truth that survived even when the world looked away. Because culture doesn't just reflect reality, it can reshape it. And the voices that emerged from the crack era refused to be silenced. They shouted, sang, and rhymed the truth until someone finally listened. The smoke may have cleared, but the scars remain. Long after the last vials were swept from the streets, the legacy of the crack era still pulses through Black America. Entire generations grew up missing pieces, parents lost to addiction, friends buried too young, dreams deferred. And though the crisis has faded from headlines, its consequences still echo in housing, healthcare, education, and incarceration. Many of the communities hit hardest by crack have never truly recovered. The economic devastation wasn't temporary, it was generational. Property values plummeted, small businesses shuttered, schools were defunded. Trauma, untreated, became cyclical, and as the world moved on, many of these neighborhoods were left frozen in time, still waiting for the aid, investment, and justice they were promised decades ago. The policies that fueled the crisis weren't rolled back overnight. Harsh sentencing laws persisted. Mass incarceration continued to swell. It wasn't until the opioid epidemic, when addiction had a whiter face, that compassion entered the conversation. Suddenly, drug users were patients, not criminals. And Black America watched, knowing that same grace was never extended to them. But the legacy isn't just one of pain, it's also one of perseverance. Many survivors of the crack era became advocates, counselors, teachers, organizers. They took their lived experience and turned it into fuel for change. They raised families, rebuilt communities, and demanded accountability. Their resilience is not just inspiring, it's instructional. It also sparked a broader reckoning. Conversations about systemic racism, the prison industrial complex, and generational trauma have grown louder. Documentaries, books, and grassroots activism have helped reframe the narrative, not as a moral failure, but as a structural one. A failure of policy, economics, and empathy. The crack era didn't just disrupt the lives of millions, it exposed the cracks in America itself. And even now, those cracks remain. But so does the will to heal them. The story isn't over. It's still being written in classrooms, in community centers, in courtrooms, and in conversations like this one. The crack era is more than history. It's a mirror. It reflects the consequences of neglect, the price of prejudice, and the cost of ignoring pain until it boils over. But it also offers lessons. Lessons about the power of community, the danger of criminalizing poverty, and the urgent need for systems that serve people instead of punishing them. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it if we're willing to look honestly. One of the clearest lessons is this: public health crises require public health responses. Crack was a medical emergency, but it was met with militarization. Addiction is not a crime, it is a condition, and had we treated it with compassion instead of force, thousands of lives might have been spared. That's a blueprint for the future. Respond to human suffering with humanity. Another lesson is about investment. What if the money spent on prisons had gone to schools, clinics, job training, and housing? What if the policies were shaped not by fear, but by fact? Communities need infrastructure, not incarceration. Safety isn't built through handcuffs. It's built through opportunity. The crack era shows us what happens when we abandon that principle. Reconciliation is harder. It demands accountability, acknowledgement, apologies that lead to action. This means policy reform, yes, but also cultural repair, changing how we talk about addiction, how we fund recovery, and how we amplify the voices of those who lived through the fire. Healing doesn't come from silence, it comes from truth-telling. And finally, there's hope. Because despite everything, the fact that so many survived, organized, created, and rebuilt is evidence that nothing is beyond redemption. The people who endured the crack era are still here, still fighting, still dreaming. They are living proof that recovery is possible, not just for individuals, but for entire communities. So we close this chapter not with despair, but with a challenge to do better, to see what was ignored, to hear what was silenced, and to build a future where no community has to survive what Black America did in the crack era ever again.